There we go. I heard recording in progress.
There we go. And I will start letting people into the room when I see them. Oh, it's auto enter to the room. Great.
Can you guys hear me?
Mhm.
Yes.
Perfect.
I see folks trickling in. Hey, everyone. Happy Thursday.
Annie, I'll say the word trickling was in my head as well. I'm glad we have similar webinar vocabulary.
Yep.
We'll just give it a minute or so more to let people join, and then we'll get started since we have a good amount to cover and want to make sure we also get people back to their day on time. Okay, it's about 2 minutes after the hour, so we will get going and have some intro slides here that hopefully as others join, they won't be missing too much. Welcome everyone, and thank you for attending our webinar between Learn, Design, Apply and Community Dynamics. We are here today to talk about NTIA's Competitive Digital Equity Grants Program. Our speakers, if we go to the next slide, myself, Annie Sersky, and we are with Learn, Design, Apply, and then Austin Thompson, who's here from Community Dynamics. And we have a few takeaways that we're hoping that you'll have. So the purpose for this webinar, why you're all here, is to one, increase awareness of the Digital Equity Act and the programs that are coming from this, especially to also understand steps you can be taking now. So some of these programs are open, some of them are not, but there's always things that you can be doing. So hoping that that will be a good takeaway for folks. And then also thoughts on forming impactful partnerships. So we're going to hear a lot of great insight from Austin on that. And again, hopefully there's some good outcomes and takeaways that you will have. So to jump right in, talking about NTIA, so the Digital Equity Act, these big amounts of funds are coming from the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and is being handled by NTIA, the National Telecommunications and Information Administration. Their acronym has become, I think, pretty well known in this arena, but wanted to give a background on who exactly they are and what they do. So their principal responsibility is to advise the president on telecom and information policy issues. Largely, they're looking at broadband access and adoption. And this ranges from the Affordable Connectivity Program to deployment to digital equity. So they first started when there was the BTOP program, and that had $4 billion that went to deploying broadband. And then now, again, we have the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which is $65 billion, a lot of money, for 4 different programs that they're going to be handling. So, who do they work with? It's a lot to do, a lot of money, and they're not handling it alone. So we have the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and this is the partner that's going to do the grant program management for NTIA. So once awards are made and once they're in the review session, and NIST is going to be the government agency that will help NTIA with these programs. An important thing to remember is that NIST employees aren't broadband or digital equity specialists. So this is an important thing when you think about the grants and who you're going to be writing for. who's going to be looking at these applications, to what extent do you want to explain acronyms that might be familiar to you, but is it going to be familiar to a NIST employee? So we bring it here just to know who the partner is, but also to keep in mind when you're putting together an application. NTIA also has designated federal program officers who work with one state or multiple in the cases of some states, as well as the territories. So the states have had a lot to do, mostly between the Digital Equity Act and deployment, the BEAD funds. They've had two sources of funding already for digital equity and big responsibilities from them. So to help support them in that, NTIA has given these states an official program officer that they work pretty closely with to hopefully make these programs as successful as possible. So what are these programs that I keep talking about? First up, in this Digital Equity Act, we have the State Digital Equity Planning Grant Program. So this was a $60 million formula grant program, which means formula, the amounts that the states were getting was a set amount. They weren't competing for it. And it went to develop these digital equity plans. So this program has happened. All of the states have a digital equity plan that they submitted to NTIA and got approved. From there, we have the State Digital Equity Capacity Grant Program. And this is one that's opened very recently. Again, a formula grant, but this time to give funds to the states to enact their digital equity plans that they put together. They're going to have 5 years to do this, and it will look different for every state. So some states are going to be giving out grants to do their digital equity work. Some are going to be much more involved in leading the projects themselves and not doing as many grants, if any at all. So this will definitely be something to monitor to see how each state and each territory is going to be spending these funds. But everyone is going to have a chance to compete for funds with the Digital Equity Competitive Grant Program. So this is a discretionary grant, which means it is competitive, right? If you are an eligible applicant, you can submit. So this includes political subdivisions, tribes, nonprofits, community anchor institutions, local education agencies, people that do workforce development. So a whole slew of organizations can apply to this. So unlike those first two where it's only meant for states and territories, this is open to a lot of folks. What we do know, and that Annie will talk about in a bit, is we have a bit of a timeline for that last one. It's not open yet, but that's why we're having this webinar to help you prepare for that last one. So going a bit further into these eligible entities. So this language here is taken straight from the legislation that created this program. So this is set in stone, approved by Congress. It would take an act of Congress to change it, which probably won't be happening. So these kind of set who's going to be able to apply for these funds. Partnerships between any of these agencies will be acceptable. The one thing I do want to point out that is unique about this, when they say a local education agency, so this is not institutes of higher education. So your state universities, your private universities will not be eligible for these funds. Local education agency, we're thinking more of a school district or that kind of entity that is overseeing multiple institutions. So wouldn't be Casa Elementary School, which was the elementary school I went to and I think is hopefully still open. I had a great time, but CASA could not apply for this program on their own. It would have to be a larger entity that's a designated educational agency. But still, there's a lot of folks who can go after these funds and can be very competitive, especially when we're looking at number 7 there of a partnership. And so this is something that is very important, and Annie and Austin are going to go a bit more into. So I will turn it over to Annie now that I have sped through this background information for you, and Annie will give some more important details of what you can be doing and what you should think about.
Awesome. Thank you, Megan. And yeah, as Megan mentioned, we don't yet have a notice of funding opportunity for this grant, but we can learn a lot from the legislation, including the eligible entities and also some of the key terminology required for the grant. So a couple things to note. You probably saw under eligible entities the term community anchor institution. Um, I realize that, this does refer to schools because it means broader, across IJA funding. In this case, they clarify it's not a school, but it can include a library, healthcare providers, state library agency, and other nonprofit or government support organization. Um, and so community anchor institution, you're going to see both in BEAD funding as well as DEA. And the idea is that these are trusted community partners who are bridging the gap between the infrastructure that provides internet and access and actual skills, adoption, etc. Another really key piece of terminology we see from the legislation is the term covered populations. Now, you might have seen this with your state plan. Use these categories of populations and were even allowed to add their own in their individual digital equity plans. However, at the federal level, these are fairly fixed. And what you can see on the bullet points here on the right are the ones you're looking at. What this means is that with competitive digital equity grants, eligible entities, so the agents that Megan covered on the last slide, must be conducting projects to serve these covered populations. I'll let you take a look. The good news, and what many people have suspected, is there's often quite a bit of overlap between these populations. So you might have aging individuals who are also veterans, people with disabilities who are also English language learners. The good news for anybody who's working at community engagement is that, people have a lot of identities, and many organizations are already in touch with these populations to deliver outcomes. Something I want to flag to folks who may be applying for these grants is think about the data that you capture about how you've impacted these groups and helped them. This will be very helpful to you as you're positioning a grant to show you already have trust in your community. The legislation also tells us a bit about the project areas or use of funds that will be eligible for the competitive digital equity grants. Here, I've pulled from the legislation. Sorry, it's a little wordy. That's on Congress, not on us. The bold are my own headers. But we can see at a high level how they want to be seeing these funds used. And so we have digital inclusion, which must pertain to these covered populations. We have broadband adoption in the education space, and this could be workforce development or some of those educational agencies that Megan has talked about. We have training programs. We have the tech that makes broadband work, that helps people actually adopt and use the infrastructure that programs like BEAD are implementing. We have computing centers, which is a great continuation of some of the grant funding that may have come as an emergency time during COVID. And then as with any legislation, we have a big asterisk to be determined based on NOFO from the legislation, that as it is written out, and depending on the focus at the time when this grant is released, we might see additional details or restraints on the way the projects can be used. What I want to make sure folks see in this, however, is that it all ties back to those covered populations, right? And so it's wonderful to have programs that are open to the public and do reach a really wide audience, but many of these uses of funds tie back directly to the impacts to those covered population groups. And I once again want to encourage folks who are thinking about applying for these kinds of grants to think now about how you're measuring the way that you provide these services. We have a little bit of a hint on the timeline for when this will be released. We know that in the way the Digital Equity Act was written, there was a bit of a stacked work back plan from when these different 3 Digital Equity Act programs are released. We are anticipating, based on the known timeline of the Digital Equity Capacity Grant, that's the one for states, that we would expect a notice of funding opportunity to open up this year, probably around late September. That notice of funding opportunity, if you're familiar with grants, will lay out the specific application rules and requirements for you to go for the funds. As you're getting ready, and even without that notice of funding opportunity, something I want to highlight to folks is that you can get ready from an administrative sense. Anybody who's done any kind of federal grants business knows they like their documentation. So one thing you can do right now is register for your unique entity identifier, or UEI, and register on sam.gov. We often recommend to our clients to be budgeting at least 8 weeks for this process. As a reminder, SAM, or the System for Award Management, is how you actually receive your federal grant dollars. They have used the DUNS number in the past, but they actually transitioned last year. So even if you've previously registered for a DUNS number, make sure you're prioritizing getting up to speed with that UEI. I will also note we've seen some scams out there. This process should be free. Lengthy, but it's free. So if you're seeing somebody offering to take your money to register for UEI, you're be on alert. Separately, you'll want to register on grants.gov. So SAM is where you receive award dollars, grants.gov is where you apply for them. This process is a little bit quicker, and we find that most people who've been doing work and serving their community or working with grant dollars often have done this already, but make sure you take the time to do it. We also have some predictable forms we often use to prepare your grant application budget and then receive and monitor your award later on. This is the standard form, or SF series, and we've listed some here. So 424 is the application, 424A, budget information for non-construction programs, and assurances as well. So these may be, old familiar for some of folks on the call, but they are complicated. And so before this application releases, now is a really good time to get your ducks in a line administratively. I also think from a brainstorming perspective, this is a really good time to think about the high level needs you want to serve and the services that you offer for the covered populations that are outlined in the legislation. So as with any grant, start to take a look at your community needs with regards to digital equity. Look at the activities and outcomes that could be supported by grant funding, really focused on digital inclusion and greater adoption of broadband among those covered populations. Think about your organizational qualifications and structure. So already from the legislation, they want to know why are you eligible to do this? And for a nationally competitive grant, usually you need a pretty good answer. This isn't officially, written down, but what we're hearing around the grapevine is some of the strong applications are going to demonstrate good partnership between organizations with proven success working with covered populations and digital equity. And so we really wanted to highlight that, that partnerships are eligible for DEA competitive grant funding. If you're looking internally at a community need you need to solve, and you need a little bit more, let's say, tech expertise, repair expertise to scale with certain populations, now is the time to begin seeking out those partnerships, not when the application opens.
I want to jump in real quick, Annie. We had a question which I think kind of goes along with what you're talking about here, which is regarding eligible entities, can a school library apply? Our reading right now is that no, a school library cannot apply. So libraries as an institution outside of a school, but not as part of a school. But what Annie's saying, to this point is that think about a partnership. So if you are a school library, who can you partner with to receive funds kind of in that trickle down to be a partner? So you can't apply, but you can, through the activities, be a part of the solution.
And that could be a district, it could be a state library association, another professional library association. A couple more things we're seeing in legislation that are just good grant, preparation, thinking about the schedule of activities you'd want to prepare, thinking about that budget and budget justification. And the reason I flag this especially is that it's required in those standard forms I mentioned before. And then thinking about other sources of funding. As with most grants, it never seems like enough to solve the full problem. We've talked a little bit about, we think maybe strong applicants will have demonstrated success in this area. That means you're probably, have built a strong organization from outside. And also be thinking about how things like other economic development, workforce development, Department of Education, the National Institute of Health, all of those different programs, which may tangentially relate back to the activities that you serve, even philanthropic funds, will really make sure that you have deep and sustainable results that go beyond just this grant. Now I'm going to hand it off to Austin to talk us a little bit more about those partnerships and collaborations that can lead to a really strong project.
Thank you, Annie and Megan, and thank you all for being here today. I'm going to talk to you about three things. First, I'm going to tell you about why partnership matters. Then I'm going to tell you 5 elements of what makes a very successful partnership, we believe, anticipating the competitive digital equity grant opportunity. And then I'm going to end with talking about some measurable indicators of whether or not you have a healthy partnership. So starting with why. There's a proverb that you may be familiar with. When spider webs unite, they can tie up a lion. And this is important as a grounding proverb, I think, in this context, because when you hear the words digital equity, it moves your heart. However, to win competitive digital equity grants, we must bring our heart and head together, because the government is going to be looking to maximize impact per dollar spent. And these are limited dollars to drive digital equity outcomes. The government is accountable to residents and citizens, and those residents and citizens want these funds spent wisely. And so many smaller community-based organizations who've done digital equity work in the past with covered populations, they may not be best positioned to directly receive the federal funding because of all of the compliance and requirements that Annie and Megan have talked about, even though they do incredibly important work. They may work at a hyper local level. And we know over the past 2 years, in multiple federal funding opportunities, we've heard very public complaints from smaller organizations about being left out of federal funding opportunities. On the flip side, organizations like anchor institutions, local educational institutions, or large nonprofits who have the compliance and other requirements in place to receive federal funding don't always have the legitimacy as authentic and reflective or representative institutions of wider communities, particularly of covered populations. And so they may not be able to show authentic community engagement. And that's going to be an issue for the competitive digital equity grant, as we've heard from previous speakers here. And I also should mention diversity. And so there is a choice to be made. And this gets into the why before I talk about 5 elements of partnerships. Why partnerships are so important is that we need to think in advance about forming alliances and coalitions that bring the best of smaller, hyper-local, community-based organizations together into alliance with larger organizations to apply once we know more about the digital equity, competitive digital equity grants. And so there's another quote that I really admire, and many of you have heard: progress moves at the speed of trust. Relationships move at the speed of trust. So the alignment and trust building should have already begun. They say that the best time to plant seeds was decades ago, and then the second best time is right now. So that's the why in the framing. Partnerships matter so much, and uniting the spider web so that we can truly tie down this lion of inequity in the digital landscape. So there are 5 elements that I would recommend based on my experience at Community Dynamix, working across the country, supporting place-based coalitions who have already been working on partnerships with governments in order to drive equitable outcomes. The first I mentioned a little bit earlier: authentic community engagement. Now, some of you know that there are community engagement efforts that exist on a spectrum. On one end of the spectrum, you're doing a survey, very low intensity. On the other end of the spectrum, there are models of deep participatory decision-making and deliberation with community members, or MOUs being signed with community-based organizations that may be hyper-local. Along that spectrum, there's a mix and a range of what we mean by community engagement. What I would recommend, if you're thinking about putting together a partnership for the competitive digital equity grants, is assume that the reviewers of the applications will be looking for truly authentic community engagement in terms of having deep deliberation and participation from community members, especially covered populations. Number two, a shared vision and set of measurable goals. This is incredibly important because maximizing the impact of these dollars requires projects that work backwards and reverse engineer from clear outcomes and impacts. Thankfully, the NTIA has actually published a set of digital equity outcomes from healthcare to education, civic participation, employment, and more. Having your partners organized around an agreed upon set of measurable goals is going to be critical. And I'll go a step further in saying it's not just measurable goals in the short term, but what's the long-term vision of how the places that this partnership is meant to support in these covered populations will look fundamentally better off years into the future because of the investment that is made now. Number three, a central backbone structure. Now, we talked a little bit earlier about the eligible entities, and I think it's clear from what I said earlier as well that not every organization is best positioned to receive federal funding. And so some people talk about it as a backbone structure or a hub and spoke model. But the idea is have a dedicated team that's going to wake up every single day thinking about supporting a coalition of partners who's going to manage the grant, who's going to take care of the compliance and the reporting and hold people accountable to the vision and the measurable goals. And one of the things that we have seen in the past is that these backbones often are successful because they've received federal or state grants before to serve. And so that is the third element here is a central backbone structure. The last two have a shared data strategy. We know that partners across the geographies and coalitions and covered populations you'll be working to bring together have their own data systems and localized data. The question is, how do you come up with a comprehensive data strategy so that over the lifetime of the digital equity project that you're submitting for funding, it's very clear to the application reviewers what that strategy is to collect and track data. And we don't have enough time. We could almost have another webinar that there is an element here in partnerships of culture change and making sure that you're bringing everybody in at the level they're comfortable in sharing data, but it's going to be a critical element. And then the last is something that Annie mentioned is where possible leveraging other funding, not funding that necessarily is duplicative, because obviously you're going to want to demonstrate how these competitive dollars are additive. But if there are local philanthropies who you might be able to get letters of support from in advance that say, look, we'll match some of the federal investment in this competitive digital equity grant, that's going to look very strong in an application. And in fact, Angela T. Bennett from the NTIA actually has talked about in a previous webinar that I did, an opportunity for philanthropy to match. So those are the 5 elements. If you're thinking about a strong partnership being put in place in anticipation of the competitive digital equity opportunity, authentic community engagement, shared vision and set measurable goals, a central backbone structure, having a shared data strategy, and then looking for opportunities to leverage other funding. We'll know whether or not these coalitions you're building are healthy by things like the number and diversity of the partnering groups and the covered populations who are involved. Are there true commitments being made from all of the stakeholders who are part of that partnership about how they're going to leverage their assets and strengths? And then scale of reach is something to think about. Working at the super hyper local level probably is not the most optimal way to approach these competitive digital equity grants from a government perspective. So trying to get more to a regional state scale of reach is in the best interest of a partnership from a health standpoint. And then finally, authentic community and participation and involvement. I can't iterate how important we believe that will be for the reviewers who are looking at this opportunity. So again, we know what's at stake. When spider webs unite, they can tie up a lion. Form those partnerships now. There are several resources available to provide capacity building and other forms of support to help communities get united for this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Austin.
Annie, if it's okay with you, I'd like between the three of us to just have a few minutes of discussion and collaboration. I know when you were talking and when Austin was talking, I was thinking of a million things that I think would be helpful to point out. It was touched upon to consider sustainability. So across any kind of grant you're looking at, sustainability is a big part. NTIA, in giving out these funds, is going to want to see that beyond their funding, you'll be able to sustain this program, right? That it's not going to have to end when the funds from NTIA end, because it is a continuous journey doing this work. It doesn't, stop at one point. Everyone has a device and you're good, right? There's a lot of work to be done. And so I think thinking about sustainability, and one of those strategies for it is these partnerships, right? Especially as Austin said, some of the hyper local ones may have a harder time with the sustainability, not always, but sometimes, but partnering with some of these larger entities, with those who have the backbone, who have this experience, is really going to work in creating that component that we know NTIA is going to be looking for.
And Megan, if I can add to that, I think there's a great case study of what that looks like in North Carolina. Um, I'm sure many of you have heard this saying before, that the past is predictive. And I don't know that that's always true in a micro sense, but certainly if you zoom out, you can see patterns in how the government has made grants in the digital equity arena based on previous grant making. And in North Carolina, they have a digital equity office and a community-based organization and partnership called North Carolina Counts actually has done a lot of the 5 elements that I talked about. They have a signed MOU with the state of North Carolina. The state of North Carolina had a competitive digital equity program. North Carolina Counts worked across all of the counties in North Carolina to bring them together for shared applications for that. And they were able, as a result, to bring in philanthropy, both in state and national, with an eye towards sustainability. And one of the things that North Carolina Counts did was they figured out that digital equity is not a single issue that's detached from other issues. Healthcare. So they were able to bring telehealth and healthcare foundations to the table. Civic participation and census. They were able to bring those funders to the table. I could go on and on. And so, from a sustainability standpoint, there's a lot you can do in this partnership architecture. And I think North Carolina is a great example. People can go out and actually look at North Carolina Counts, and there's plenty of public testimony in North Carolina about the impact they've had in previous competitive digital equity applications.
I
Awesome.
think, and
Go ahead,
Megan,
Annie.
to your point, something that Austin said is a question I've gotten from a lot of people is, hang on, we've been doing digital equity forever, either through past grants or digital equity by other names. We see the work that libraries and schools are doing, or workforce development to teach digital skills. So why now? Why is digital equity such a big deal? Something that we've seen, at least on the broadband side, is we potentially, with upcoming BEAD money, have communities that are going to get way more access to the internet than they've had in the past. Right. And so something I would say too is as you're looking at what partnerships are working well already in your state, also be looking at upcoming infrastructure plans. Do you have new rural areas or even left behind urban pockets that are suddenly going to have new problems to solve with internet access? And how could digital equity programs and support make sure that it goes well? Megan, back to you.
I was gonna say, I have a question that I would love to hear from you, Annie, because I know you've had this experience, and then also Austin. I know, so we've talked a lot about the benefit of partnerships, how to go about it. Austin's great 5 points, but it's not easy. It's not easy to have this important public engagement. And so Annie and Austin, I think it would be helpful, we've talked about the great grand ideas, but to hear from both of you about some of the challenges and how to think about facing those. So Annie, I don't know if you want to start us off with your experience.
Yeah. I've had the opportunity to be in many communities that are talking about their very early stage plans. How do we as a county or city or township think about digital equity? We're noticing in some communities the word equity becomes a sticking point. It is a pretty political word. I'm really excited about equity. I'm excited about what this grant could offer to underserved areas. And so I think there is an element with any federal grant of making sure you're translating it to your local stakeholders. And I'm not saying to stop focusing on equity, it's to pay attention to the outcomes you want to reach that, deliver more equitable world for your residents, and think about what that means. So that could be opportunity, it could be development, it could be training, all of those things. I think a challenge with federal work is it can feel very far away, often an office in DC. But I think it's very important to take advantage of this and not let language block you. And so I would encourage you to spend some time with the legislation and the NOFA when they come out and think about your listeners and what they would want to hear to be open to this conversation. What about you, Austin?
Couldn't agree with that more. And some states are saying digital connectivity in other language, and that's totally fine as long as the substance is there. And I heard that directly from Angela T. Bennett from NTIA. So double clicking on Annie's great point. I would make another point, which is that you should really anchor to outcomes in a strategy as opposed to anchoring to this application. And this is important because, to get clear about what's your shared vision and measurable goals over the long term, where are the assets that you bring together, and working backwards from that, building trust around that vision. When it comes to things like money, hopefully our commitments will go well beyond this one individual grant. So that's one piece here, is really being anchored around the outcomes and the longer term vision, not necessarily about this one grant. Now, we understand that some of you are going to be inspired to form these partnerships because of this grant. But I would just caution that, there will be other opportunities for these coalitions that you build, if you don't already have them, to leverage other funding. The second thing I would say is Megan and I were on a panel at the Broadband Community Summit, and we had a questioner. This is just last week. We had a questioner who asked a question saying, hey, we received these funds at the state level, competitive digital equity funds at the state level. And I won't say the state, but and there were questions from folks who had been around for a while, who had done hyper local programs. Why weren't we included? And it kind of surfaced and created challenges for everybody involved, including with the funders. And so the advice I gave them was to start off doing smart stakeholder mapping and to try to be anticipatory of who are the stakeholders in this place, our region, our state, who we want to have ride alongside us or with us as we're forming this application, so that even if they don't sign the MOU or the partnership agreement formally, informally, they feel like they had a voice and say, and their concerns and issues were part of this ongoing process. And so that goes to the community involvement piece of this. I think it can be easily overlooked how important the social, the emotional elements of this process are. And so that stakeholder mapping in advance is an essential element, I think, of forming a healthy partnership long term.
Absolutely. I think my last point there would be, I think, something that's kind of underlying a lot of these and that we've touched on is that there is some distrust in communities. And one of the benefits of having these partners who are hyperlocal, who have been doing the work, is that you then build the trust in the community that's already there. Especially when it comes to government things, there's a lot of distrust that it's ever going to happen, that it's ever going to show up, and it's not going to do anything for my community. And so having a partner who is trusted, a lot of times it can be a church. Are they a partner in helping communicate? We had a partnership. One of their people was a barbershop, because that was where people in that community went to talk about things. So making sure that you find someone who can be trusted to use, as Annie said, this language that will resonate to get the projects going. So I want to open it up to question and answer. We do have one in our Q&A that I think we can address now. And then if you do have a question, please feel free to raise your hand or put it in the chat. But to start off, the question here about Mississippi, and I think we could extend this probably to a lot of states, that they're just not getting enough money for this work. That there is a lot to be done. As Austin said, there's so many components of this, right? There's the civic engagement, there's the telehealth, there's the skills to use devices, and there's just not enough money coming to states. My inclination is that we're not going to see much more in this program. There may be other programs, and what I will say is that some of the work that is done can fit into grants that may not necessarily be, called a digital equity competitive program. That there are, to Annie's point, historically people have been doing this work, but they haven't called it digital equity, right? And so some of those grants are still around, and looking to those for sources of funding. And Austin, I think you can absolutely speak to philanthropy. I know Annie and I are deep in the grants world, but you've had much more exposure there. And do you see that investment as a for sure and continued thing?
Well, I was first going to say, when I saw Mississippi, I was going to say you should reach out to Jamie Raspberry in Mississippi. I think she would be a good contact. And then I realized that it is Jamie who asked this question, and which is wonderful. So Jamie, you know a lot here. And I think what I would say is very similar to what Megan said, is less than 1% of all philanthropic funding goes to digital equity. And that is a shame, full stop. But I think there's an opportunity in what Megan just said so artfully. These 5 or so digital equity outcomes, there are foundations that focus on those priority areas, including funders who are extremely interested in Mississippi and the Mississippi Delta and other parts of Mississippi. And so I think in other parts of the country. So I think my recommendation would be, we need to do donor education now and convene funders now about this opportunity specifically, and talk about it and frame it working backwards from the 5 digital equity outcomes, not necessarily leading with digital equity itself. And that's where I would start. And there's national philanthropy, but I think a lot of the opportunity is going to be community foundations and place-based funders who have a stake in the long-term trajectory of those communities. A great example of this is the Appalachian Regional Commission has been partnering with a philanthropic intermediary, Connect Humanity. And that model, I think, sets a precedent for what might be possible in other places here with place-based partnerships with philanthropy. There is a Delta Regional Commission, not just Mississippi, but that entire region. And I would be curious, what are the partnership opportunities with other regional philanthropic and state funders as part of this opportunity? So we have to do a lot of donor education, working backwards from those digital equity outcomes.
I will do a quick plug. Next week, LDA is doing a webinar with Connect Humanity, in which we're going to talk about how cybersecurity is a part of digital equity, and then some background information on cybersecurity and what it is and why it's a requirement and why it's something that everyone should be thinking about. So to Austin's point, Connect Humanity and the Appalachian Regional Commission, both fantastic organizations. And I think I want to combine what Annie said and what Austin said, almost opposite ends of the spectrum, is using the language that's going to resonate with the community and using language that's going to resonate with the philanthropies, right? Because it might be different, and what is their mission statement that you can then tie into and show them, why this is something that is relevant to them, and you need doing that education. Annie, I see you came off mute.
I know, I got so excited. Outside of like traditional core philanthropy too, I just also want to make sure people are thinking creatively about the way, for-profit or private companies in their area might be interested in the outcomes here. So two things that come to mind are one with workforce development, talent programs, companies that have incoming talent that are well-versed in digital skills are really happy. And they may be more willing to extend a hand if there's a pipeline for good talent for them. The second are, of course, technology vendors, right? When they see that there's potential customers and potential use for their devices, their ears perk up. This is less so your traditional, donors, but this might be another area of partnerships that will be mutually beneficial.
Absolutely. So I think on our next slide, perhaps, or maybe it's the one after that, we do have a list of resources, certainly not exhaustive, but some of the common ones that do go into a bit more detail on what we've covered here, as well as having other great points. Obviously, Austin, Annie, and myself are here for any members still here listening to talk about these things. We're clearly very passionate about it, but there are a great number of resources to further educate yourself, not only about this grant, but about digital equity work and partnerships. So we'll certainly be sending out these slides to the attendees here, as well as posting this webinar on the LDA website, and Austin sharing it with many of his colleagues and wider network as well. I do want to open it for any last questions, and we can certainly give you back a few minutes of your day if we don't have those coming in. And again, you can always still reach out to us if you don't want to ask it here, and we can answer it another time. Okay, well, I'm not seeing them come in. So again, if you have them, please feel free to reach out. And I just want to thank everyone for coming today, for participating, and for being a part of this webinar. And we hope to see some great work coming from this. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, y'all.